Hi everybody, and welcome back to the wonderful, so to speak, video game basement room thing that totally is not unfinished. Anyway, this one is going to be more of a history lesson, and it's going to be about the console war. Well, I wouldn't say console war, more like console wars with a plural S. And that's mostly because, as much as everybody used to talk about oh, how Sega and Nintendo fought each other in this big conflict called the console war, there's actually three. Okay? There was the... Oh yeah, by the way, I'm going to name these console wars the same way wars would be named in the game Hearts of Iron 4. So, I'm sorry if these don't have very original or very imaginative names, but they're meant to be descriptive of what's going on, or who's fighting who. I'm going to break this up into three parts. The first part I'll be talking about is the Atari-Mattel War, the second is the world-famous Sega-Nintendo War, and then thirdly is going to be the war between Microsoft and Sony, who, by the way, decided it would be a good idea to launch almost at a similar amount of time to fight each other with flawed systems, which I'll get into in that third part. So anyway, the Atari-Mattel War. This all started because Atari originally released the Atari 2600, except it wasn't called the 2600 in 1977 when it was released. It was called the Atari VCS, or Video Computer System, because it was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first video game systems to have a microprocessor with a GPU, a CPU, with some integrated sound stuff, the TIA chip that, or maybe, I don't know what it's called, but I forgot what it's called exactly. The graphics chip in the 2600 had integrated I/O stuff and sound. And Atari was king at this point. It managed to innovate past the primordial ooze of Pong consoles, save for Fairchild Semiconductor, which released the Fairchild Channel F. The reason it's called the Channel F was because it went into obscurity right when Atari released their console, but the Fairchild Channel F was the first to use... Sorry, that was gross. To do two things. One, to have a CPU, a GPU, and other bits and bobs, you know, like a computer, and interchangeable ROM cartridges, even though the only thing it really did was do many different variations of Pong consoles and other games you couldn't do in a Pong system. But, you know, the system was incredibly limited, and when the Atari 2600 came out, it was more technically superior, but eh. So anyway, Atari was essentially the king of the hill at this point. And through 78, 79, they were on top. However, there was a little company called Mattel. You might know them for something called Barbie or Hot Wheels. I don't really know. Eh. And what they did was they started a video game development task force. I wouldn't really call it a studio. Because it's more than just developing games. They also, you know, it made hardware and did other things. It was a whole bunch of other stuff. And what they went and did was developed a system called the Mattel Intellivision. And what the Intellivision did was to do everything that Atari did, but better. And to be a versatile, all-in-one system. In fact, when they announced the Intellivision at CES, I think in 1978, when they were still developing it, it was not only was it the first 16-bit console ever, which I'll make a video explaining why, even though it doesn't look 16-bit, it actually is. I'll do that in another video. And here is the thing. I don't know where I was going with that. Like I said, these are all unscripted in a previous video, of course. And Mattel was not only was it going to be a video game system, but you could also use it for edutainment. And there's a special module where you could put it inside a thing that turned it into a home computer. Obviously, the folks at Mattel were very forward-thinking, and later when Coleco made the ColecoVision, they had similar ideas and flopped hard with the Atom computer. Apparently my dad owned one of those. Weird. He also owned a TurboGrafx 16, which makes my dad even more of an oddball. But that's beside the point. So, the Intellivision was test marketed in 1979 and was fired off and released in 1980. And the marketing campaign was just slinging the mud at Atari. They said, oh, look at the graphics in our games. Look at how much our sports games are more realistic than Atari's. And by the way, this is before the days of Madden, before the days of 2K. This was before the days where sports games, not only did they push systems, but also graphically the same. Not to say they all look bad, but, you know, whatever. Later, Sega would use sports games as a way to sell systems, but we'll get to that when we get there. So then they were slinging mud at Atari, like saying, we have the better graphics, we have the better sound. In fact, the Mattel Intellivision would use the same PSG sound chip, you know, with its 3 square channels and 1 noise channel, to be used in the Master System, which I have over here. So, Mattel was just slinging mud at Atari. They were saying all sorts of batshit things at Atari, and Atari was like, that's it. We have to innovate. And so, they did 2 things. One, they created the Real Sports line of sports games to try and get the jump on Mattel by creating ultra-realistic, hyper-realistic even, sports games, which is laughable considering that the Atari barely had not even like a kilobyte of RAM. Like, I think like maybe like 512 bytes. Which is, you know, even though it did have a MOS Technologies 6502 by 1 megahertz, still, the Atari is kind of wimpy against Mattel's hefty. So, then things just sort of went from there. And another thing Atari did was to develop a new system, something that was technically superior to the Mattel Intellivision in every way possible. They did this by taking the Atari 8-bit line of home computers, you know, the Atari 400, the Atari 800, they're about the same, the only difference is features and RAM. So, they took that, even though the consumer electronics division of Atari and the home computer division of Atari were 2 separate entities that absolutely hated each other's guts, but still they managed to consoleize an Atari 400 computer, which made the Atari 5200 one of the most powerful consoles of the day. That would be released around, I think, either 1981, 1982. So, Mattel then was decided to throw another FU at Atari by releasing the Mattel Electronics, the voice synthesis module, which, you know, added voice synthesis, meaning your games could talk. This was before the days of bad voice acting. Before you had bad voice acting on the Sony PlayStation, on the Sega CD, you had bad computerized voice acting on your Intellivision. I mean, who could remember such wonderful as Mattel Electronics presents B-17 Bomber or Bomb Squad? You'll never do it in time. The code, figure out the code. It won't be easy. Cut this out. then second, then third. See what I mean? So then Atari releases the 5200, and it's complicating, and it's about to get a hell of a lot more complicated, because this is part in the video game industry, and remember, this is the second generation of consoles, and things were about to get crazy. Or so Bell Worst said in one of his videos. So things are about to get crazy! And they did! First, there was Vectrex. Then there was, in 1979, the Magnavox Odyssey 2. There was a lot of consoles out on the market. Consumers were getting confused, and this will become a problem, but not right now. So then, Atari and Mattel are just at each other. They one-upped each other by releasing new hardware. They one-upped each other by trying to prove each other's system is better at sports games, even though technically the Intellivision would be better because it has more buttons. And then another actor in this wonderful play appeared, Coleco, with a ColecoVision, which then became the most powerful home console on the market, mostly because it had the same specs, or at least similar specs, to an MSX computer. That's right, in 1982, you can get a home computer that's just as good as a Japanese home computer. Try explaining that one. That and the Sega SG-1000 would later use the same hardware, except more RAM. But that's neither here or there. What is here or there is the Atari-Mattel war. So now, not only is Atari fighting Mattel, but Atari is fighting Coleco. They're fighting Vectrex. They're fighting Magnavox. And, by the way, Mattel is fighting the same people. And so is Coleco. So is Vectrex and the Odyssey 2. And this would all culminate in the video game crash of 1983. And that effectively killed off the war. And the console war between Atari and Intellivision, and by extension Coleco and everybody else, ended in a sort of stalemate. Imagine, like, it's weird because it's like imagining the Korean War, but before the two world wars. Which is a bit odd, considering things, but it essentially ended the same way as the Korean War. It ended in a stalemate where everybody just sort of got bored and decided to move on to other things. The reason they moved on to other things and got bored in the first place is because they all got bankrupt. Coleco pretty much stopped making consoles, yet they supported their system for like another few years. But later Coleco would release the Cabbage Patch Kids before dying. Mattel would later dissolve their electronics division, and all new games that would be made for the Intellivision would be done through mail order. And thus the system got supported even further until 1991. Or 1990, one of those years. The Atari 5200 promptly died, but then got reborn, only to be killed off by the 7800 by Jack Tramiel. Try explaining that one, kiddos, because the 7800, even though it was graphically on par with the NES and the Master System, but only slightly, it had a shitty sound chip. In fact, it used the same sound chip as the 2600, even though it could have easily used the Pokey chip that the 5200 had, but this is the part in Atari history where Atari stopped making good decisions. Then you have Mattel and the Atari. The Atari 2600 would somehow live on. In fact, it would live on throughout the entire 1980s as a sort of a low-cost budget system that people who sort of grew up gaming in the 70s and the early 80s would give to their kids as birthday gifts in the late 80s. Even though by then they were either owned an Atari, even though by then they either was happy with a Nintendo, or you were that weird kid, that one weird kid, the one that lives a few houses down who owns a Master System. The one. Then you have... Then the Atari 2600 lived on until 1991, where it was promptly discontinued. And by then, the Atari had essentially lived through 3 different decades. Not to say that it didn't last 30 years. It lasted a little less than that. Maybe like 14 years, give or take. But by and large, the Atari lived on much longer than it had to, and despite being the technically inferior system, managed to outlive the Coleco, the Intellivision, and the other systems. Which is strange. So, technically Atari won this war, but this was after Atari got pretty much its ass handed to itself financially. After being broke up into 2 different companies, after deciding that consoles weren't a great idea, decided to go into home computers because Jack Tramiel saw what Commodore was doing with the Amiga and decided, hey, we can do the same shit with a Motorola 68K. And they did. Just with crappier sound and graphics. And so, technically, Atari won. But this was after everybody else lost. So, I wouldn't say, in the end, it was sort of more like the Korean War, but it's like the Korean War ended in atomic oblivion. Which is strange to put it, but I guess that's how the ball rolls. Unless you're the Amiga, where the ball always rolls. Or one, say, roll, bounce around the screen. Anyway, this is part 1 of 3 of my video game console war series. Doodles. Oh yeah, before I go, like and subscribe. See ya.